The train screamed into Sagebrush Crossing with a thin metallic whine that scraped the sky. Dust lifted in coils and hung there tasting of iron and old wood. Nora Vale stepped down from the last car in a gray dress dulled by miles, hat wilted a carpetbag tugging at her wrist. She held a folded paper that shook in her hand. The seal read Sagebrush Registry. The signature read Jack Rourke. The platform was almost empty. 2 ranch hands hovered by crates of flour and salt pork. The station master shouted about baggage and schedules, his voice swallowed by the wind. Nora licked dry lips, searched faces she did not know, and found a man leaning against a post near the freight office. Hat tipped low, sleeves rolled, hands rough veins like twisted wire. He watched the yard the way a hawk watches a field. She went to him because there was no one else to go to. Her throat tightened against words. They came anyway. Mr. Rourke. He straightened a little, not quite surprised, but the stillness in him changed. That's my name, he said. His eyes dropped to the paper when she held it out. He read in a quick scan, and with every line his face went from blank to dark. The signature was his. The hand that made it was not. Who wrote this? He asked. Silas Vane, she said. From the registry. He arranged it. You sent for a bride. I came from Kansas City. At the sound of the name, something in his jaw set. He folded the paper once, then again, clean and hard. I never sent for a bride. That man runs tricks for a living. The wind pushed grit under Nora's eyelids. She blinked against the sting. There must be some mistake. There isn't, he said. And the way he said it left no room for wishing. The station master's bell clanged. The train hissed and began to creep metal groaning as if it too were tired of the place. Nora tightened her grip on the bag until the handle cut her palm. I don't have anywhere else, she said, the words barely more than breath. You need to see Sheriff Harlan Pike, the man said. He'll sort what can be sorted. She nodded. The platform tilted. The bag slid from her fingers. Her knees gave and the boards jumped up to meet her. They didn't. He moved faster than he looked, like he could caught her under the arms and lifted her before she struck the planks. Damn it, he muttered, not at her, not exactly. You're half starved. He got her to a wagon that smelled of sun-baked sap and horse. The hills beyond town rose in dusty folds. A telegraph wire sang a faint high note in the wind. He set her on the bench, climbed up, flicked the reins. The wheels found every rut on the road out. Sage and juniper breathed a sharp green as they climbed toward the dark line of Ash Mesa. The Rourke place sat on a shoulder of rock with its back to the sky. A one-room cabin, a lean-to, for tools a corral with a gate that dragged. The porch boards gave under his weight and sighed under hers. Inside, the light fell thin and steady. He swung a narrow cot out from the wall by the stove and offered her water first, then a heel of bread. She ate small, careful bites like a person used to making food last. Where am I? She asked when strength found her voice. My place, he said. Rourke outfit. You can rest tonight. In the morning we go to town and talk to the sheriff. Thank you, Mr. Rourke, Jackie said. He busied himself with the kettle as if the kettle were a complicated machine. The lid clicked. The rising heat made a high whistle that threaded the rafters. Nora closed her eyes and let it carry her for a moment. The whistle softened, turned to quiet. Her hand stilled on the blanket. Sleep climbed over her like a slow tide. Jack stood by the window with a coffee mug gone cold. The blue was falling out of the sky, and the mesa had turned the color of an old bruise. He could hear her breathing small and steady beneath the crack and sigh of the stove. He told himself none of this touched him. Then the truth brushed his ribs and proved him wrong. He pulled the folded paper from his coat and looked at the seal again. Sagebrush Registry, his name written by a liar. He took a match to the corner and watched fire creep the fibers. The ink bled, once then blackened. When he dropped the page in a tin basin, it curled and split. Ash lifted when he breathed on it. The room smelled of singed glue and cheap wax, the things that hold false promises together. On the mantel over the stove, a small oval photograph leaned at an angle. Two men in stiff collars, one of them younger, both of them trying not to grin. Jack set the matchbook down and adjusted the frame so it sat square. Matthew Rourke. Years hadn't erased the shape of the boy's ears or the way he had always stood a little too close to keep other men from reading what Jack could not say. Jack's thumb came away dusty. Nora turned on the cot and half woke the words sliding out before she could stop them. I have nowhere else. He pretended he did not hear. He set a pot with beans on the back of the stove and threw a log on the fire and cleaned his knife with a rag that should have been retired. The knife had a notch just above the bolster. Old work. He put it away. He tried to put the moment away with it. It did not go. She woke fully to the sound of spoons and the smell of pepper. He handed her a tin plate and waited while she ate. Her hands shook, then steadied. She kept her eyes on the food and the fire. He kept his eyes on the knot in a floorboard that had a shape he had seen every day and never named. "My mother said hope makes fools," she said without looking up. "Sometimes fools cross deserts." He did not smile, but his mouth remembered how. "Sometimes it keeps a person moving long enough to matter," he said. The kettle whistled again, brighter this time. He poured water into 2 chipped mugs. They sat in the sound of the cabin settling and the wind touching the roof, and a coyote far off announcing a philosophy no one asked to hear. Nora's eyelids sank. When the cup slipped in her hand, Jack took it and set it aside. "You can take the bed," he said. "I'll sit up." "I'm fine here," she said, already somewhere between waking and down. He went outside when the walls felt close. The night air had a mineral taste after the rain that had passed 2 days back. In the yard, the fence posts threw shadows the length of a room. He walked to the gate and found the top rail loose. He told himself he would fix it in the morning. On the nearest post where rope had rubbed varnish thin, a small rough V had been scratched with a nail. He brushed it without thinking, and his fingertip came away gritty. The telegraph wire sang higher when the wind shifted. Far off on the rim of Ash Mesa, a horse and rider stood cut from the sky. The shape did not move. A whistled note carried across the empty. Jack listened without blinking until the sound fell out of the air. He waited a few breaths more, then turned back toward the door and the light inside that made a square on the ground. He did not look back again. Morning came in a wash of pale gold over Ash Mesa. Jack had been moving since first light, checking the north fence, reading hoof prints, letting the cold chew the last of the sleep from his bones. When he rode back, the cabin had a thin line of smoke from the stovepipe, and the porch had been swept into neat fans. Nora stood at the rail with a hammer and a handful of bent nails hair escaping its braid skirt hemmed dark with dew. "You do not have to do that," he said. She kept her eyes on the loose board. It was leaning, goats like an open gate. He took the hammer anyway, slid the board flush, drove 2 straight nails. She handed him a tin cup from the bucket water, cold enough to ache his teeth. Their fingers touched for a beat. He stepped back as if the rail had shocked him. "You are a guest here," he said. "Guests pay for comfort. I only have hands." The day warmed into something clean and dry. Jack mended a cinch strap in the shade. Nora scrubbed the steps with a brush until the wood lifted a sweet smell. When Lila Hart rattled up in a wagon with a crate of eggs and a jar of milk, she sat the reins on her lap and looked around with an approving little grunt. "This place remembers people," she said. "It sounds like a house again." Nora wiped her palms on her skirt. "Thank you for the milk." Lila bent toward the stove, lifted a lid with a rag, let steam kiss her face. "Tro holds heat longer than flame," she said, as if she were speaking to herself. "Remember that." She turned, saw the faint gray in Nora's cheeks. "You eat enough." "She is catching up," Jack said, and kept his eyes on the leather in his hands. Lila's gaze moved quick and kind, catching things other people missed. On the yard post, she brushed a fingertip over a ragged scratch shaped like a V. "Fresh," she murmured. "Some boys need hobbies that do not involve other people's property." She flicked the grit from her finger and looked at Jack. "Watch your fence." Nora went with Lila to town that afternoon for flour and kerosene. The road into Sagebrush Crossing ran past a row of cottonwoods and a bone-pale creek bed. In the store, the floorboards creaked, and the bell over the door made a bright metallic ring that felt too loud. 2 women by the counter cut their voices in half without cutting their glances. "That is her," one whispered. "The post bride." Nora measured sugar into a tin with steady hands. Lila stepped between her and the whispers with the ease of someone who had been blocking wind all her life. "If you want to speak, speak to me," Lila said. "If you want to hiss, take it outside. We keep food in here." The women left with soft apologies and hard looks. The bell sang again. Nora stood very still until the sound died. "It is easier to hate a stranger than to know what happened," she said. Lila tied off a parcel with twine and put it into Nora's bag. "Then let them know it. That is all you can do." They rode back with the sun high and white. Dust rose and fell. When they turned up the road to the mesa, Sheriff Harlan Pike sat his horse at the gate hat, tipped jaw set. He nodded to Lila, then to Nora, then to Jack when Jack came from the corral. "Heard talk at the depot," Harlan said. "Silas Vane is peddling wives across county lines. Paper that looks clean until you put it under a hot light. He tends to collect on what he thinks he's sold." Jack's mouth thinned. He came by the name Rourke Honest Sheriff. Harlan's eyes cut to the scratch on the post. "You did not put that there." "No." The sheriff shifted in the saddle. "I will make my rounds closer. Lock what locks you have." His gaze landed on Nora, not unkind. "If a man you do not know calls you Mrs. Anything, do not believe him. "I did not," she said. Harlan touched the brim of his hat and rode off with a soft cluck. The telegraph wire sang in the wind like a tuning fork. Evening laid cool on the yard. Jack brought a bucket of dishes to the basin by the steps. Nora rolled her sleeves and plunged her hands into water that steamed against the night. A star broke over the ridge slow as a match head. She hummed without thinking, a soft thread of melody notes that belonged to kitchens, to storms that rattled shutters. Jack stopped with a plate in his hand. "My mother used to sing that when clouds stacked over the pasture." "Mine too," Nora said. She smiled at the dish she held as if the tune had made a small promise, and she wanted to keep it. They worked in the pocket of that sound. Water smacked tin. Crickets made their rough music. Somewhere far off, a coyote threw his voice at the moon, and the hills sent it back thin. When the last plate leaned on the rack, Nora dried her hands and looked toward the dark. "I am going to town tomorrow," she said. "I will find a room over the livery or the church." Jack set the towel down. "The sheriff will meet us at the office. We will get the matter written. Then you can decide your room." Her chin lifted a fraction. "People have already decided for me. The store has eyes. So did the street. So does your fence." "A roof is a roof," Jack said. "It keeps rain off a name just the same." "A roof cannot fix ink," she said. She went inside and came back with a small canvas satchel. She packed it slow on the porch, each thing a square of cloth folded right, a book that had lost its spine, a worn pair of boots. Her back stayed straight. "You can stay here tonight," Jack said. The word stay sounded strange, coming from his mouth like a nail he was not sure where to drive. "The sheriff will meet us at first light." She bound the satchel and set it by the door. "Thank you for the stew, Mr. Rourke." "Jack," he said. "Jack," she repeated, and the way she shaped it turned the yard quiet. Clouds had been building to the west, low and mean. The first wind came through with a smell of wet tin. The telegraph wire sang higher. The kettle inside began to fuss, a thin whistle that rose and fell as if the little pot were catching its breath. He went in and pulled it from the flame. The sound settled into a shy hiss. They ate in the soft light without much talk. She had learned his kitchen the way people learn a hymn, by listening for where the pauses fall. After she folded the rag and set it by the basin, he put his chair back under the table with his boot. "You do not have to leave because some fool in town cannot keep from chewing another person's name," he said. "You do not owe me anything. That does not mean you belong to anyone else." She looked at him only for a moment. The moment was enough to show the shape of tired behind her eyes and the muscle in her jaw that held the line. "I am not a debt," she said. "I am not an error to be corrected either." The wind shouldered the house. A candle flame in the window bowed and righted. Rain came in a scatter, found the dry places, darkened them. Jack checked the latch on the door, then the shutters. He moved through the room, counting the small things that could be done in weather as if work could order the air. He stopped at the mantel. The oval photograph sat square as he had left it. Matthew looked back at him with that old loyalty fixed in his eyes. Jack set 2 fingers on the frame, then took them away. He glanced toward the loose top rail at the gate and told himself again he would fix it in the morning. On the porch, Nora stood with her hands around a mug, steam slipping against her face, damp already beating on the rim. She watched the yard blur and sharpen between gusts. The satchel leaned against the door, like a small animal waiting to be named. "Do you ever get used to the quiet?" she asked. "You stop pushing against it," he said. She nodded and took a last swallow. The rain grew a voice. The wind pulled a higher note from the wire one that made the hair on his arms prick. Somewhere on the mesa, a horse stamped. The night answered with its own small creaks and the wet crack of a limb letting go. Nora went inside and set the candle on the table, then cupped the flame as if it were a throat she could shield from a cough. It flickered hard and steadied. She lay down her satchel by the door again, then moved it a finger's breadth away, as if the length of a breath mattered. Jack stood in the doorway and looked past the porch into the dark. On the nearest post, the little V caught the candle's light and threw it back not bright just enough. The kettle on the stove gave one last thin sound and fell quiet. He pulled the door in and felt the latch take. The wind shifted. A whistled note came across the open from the rim, long and level, as a thread pulled tight. Jack kept his hand on the latch and listened until the note dissolved and left only the rain. He breathed once, then let his fingers lift. The candle leaned toward the draft and held. The square of light on the floor cut clean across the wood. Outside, the wire sang again. Inside, the room gathered itself and waited. By noon, the clouds had pulled apart into thin white rags. The yard looked scrubbed clean. Jack checked the cinch on his gelding and kept one ear on the road below the mesa. The wire over the track gave a faint high note that never meant anything good to him. A horse came out of the cottonwoods at an easy lope. The rider sat tall in a dark coat without a speck of dust. Silas Vane reined in at the gate as if it were his, then smiled like a man about to sell a miracle. "Afternoon to you, Mr. Rourke." Jack stayed where he was. Afternoon. Nora stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame. The kettle fussed on the stove behind her. Lila's jar of milk sat in a pool of light on the table. Silas let his gaze slide past Jack to the cabin. "Mrs. Rourke," he said in a tone that fit a church aisle. Nora did not move. "My name is Nora Vale." Silas laughed as if someone had told a clever joke. He reached inside his coat and brought out a folded paper cream, thick edges pressed. He opened it slow so the light would catch the seal. "Contract," he said. "Signed and stamped under the sagebrush registry. A debt was taken on your behalf. Miss Vale and a gentleman's fee was paid. Either the fee comes back to me or the lady does. That is how an agency keeps order." Jack stepped in front of the door without making a show of it. "She is not a parcel. She does not belong to you." Silas set a knuckle on the top rail as if testing a counter. The scratch shaped like a V sat there in plain sight. His eyes flicked to it once then away. "Papers keep people honest," he said. "That is why God gave us ink. That and the tax man." "You have 5 seconds to turn your horse," Jack said. He did not raise his voice. He did not put his hand on his gun. The way he stood did the work. Silas looked sorry for him. "You have built yourself a quiet little kingdom up here. Roof that keeps the world out. That is nice. It is also thin kindling. I would hate to see it catch." He tipped his hat to Nora. "Consider what is easiest, Mrs. Rourke. Sometimes the easy way is the only way." He mounted, gathered his reins, and rode back toward the cottonwoods without hurry. The wire over the track sang once and went dull. Jack watched him until the road bent out of sight. When he turned, Nora was still at the door, pale under the heat. "He will come back," she said. "Let him find a shut door," Jack said. He put his hand on the gate where the V-cut had roughened the grain. The splinter bit his skin. He closed his hand and let it. Afternoon fell into gray. The wind shifted from south to east. The kettle's whistle thinned and rose, then calmed. Jack checked the barn twice and tied the stall ropes with clean knots. He set a lamp in the window and another on the mantel. Nora moved the way a person moves in a room where one foot knows which board will creak. She set bowls on the table, then took one away to make space for the rifle. The first knock was not a knock. It was the door giving under a shoulder. The latch held, then slipped. Rain came with the men. Silas stepped in out of the wet with 3 behind him and his hat brim dripping. He looked larger in the lamplight than he had in the yard. The smile he brought inside did not reach his eyes. "Evening, Rourke. We left our manners outside. Forgive us." Jack raised the rifle to his shoulder. "You should have kept them company." Silas tilted his head as if listening for something. One of the men shifted and put a hand to his belt. Nora stood at the foot of the small stairs, her palm on the banister, the way a person puts a hand on a tree before crossing water. "Now let us all be sensible," Silas said. "You hand over my book and my property, and I will be on my way." He looked at Nora when he said property. The word sat in the room like a bad smell. "Your book," Jack said. "That I believe. Your property, no." Silas's eyes flattened. The man nearest the door drew and fired in the same breath. The room cracked with light. Jack fired back, and the sound took the air out of his chest. The first man shouted and went down holding a shoulder that shot blood warm and fast across the floorboards. The second rushed with his head low, and Jack met him with the rifle like a club would, slamming bone the man pinwheeling into the table. Nora yelled without meaning to. Her voice came back at her from the rafters. Silas put 2 bullets into the edge of the stove that sent iron teeth across the room. One clipped Jack's sleeve and raised heat along his skin like a match held close. Lamp smoke went gray and bitter. The third man took one look at the mess fired high and ran through the door into rain. Lightning lit the cabin so bright the walls disappeared. For a breath, the whole room was a silver plate. Then darkness took the edges back. Jack stood breathing hard with the rifle low and ready. The man on the floor moaned. The one in the table started to come to and thought better of it. Silas had a cut on his cheek that made a neat line. He reached for the satchel he had brought in, missed the strap, grabbed it again. Something small and dark tumbled from it and hit the wet floor with a sound no one heard over the rain. He saw Jack see it. He bared his teeth. "You will choke on this," Silas said, and ran out into the storm. Nora did not move for a count of 10. Her chest hurt. She made herself breathe. Jack stepped forward and towed the fallen thing from the water toward the dry. A black leather book. No title. Ties broken. The corner of a page stuck to the floor. Jack peeled it up careful and set the book on the table. Sheriff Harlan Pike came in with Lila on his heels not long after. The The sheriff took one look at the door and the men and the holes in the stove and said the words a man says when he is tired of seeing his county used for sport. He sent a deputy to fetch the doctor and another to sit the wounded in a chair. Then he turned to the book. He set it beside the lamp and opened it gently. Ink had bled into the wet, but names stood their ground. Dozens of them lined in a neat hand that did not hide its pride. Dates, amounts, towns, and box numbers. Harlan's jaw worked as he read. Lila stood close, chin lifted, eyes going sharp and wet in one breath. Nora came nearer and looked when she was ready. Her name sat in the middle of a page, as plain as if carved into a beam. Nora Vale. Her breath thinned, then settled. She put a fingertip to the edge and took it away before the paper could cling. "This is not matchmaking," Lila said. Her voice had no tremor. "This is buying and selling." Harlan nodded once. "This will stay with me." He turned a few pages with the care of a man working a fuse. The lamplight showed the ghost of numbers through the paper. He closed the book and set his hand on it. "Silas will come hunting this." "Let him hunt it at my office rather than here," Jack said. Lila moved to the stove, lifted the lid with a fork, and set the book on a trivet near the heat to take the wet out of the cover. Little curls of ash rose off the strings where fire had kissed them the last time someone tied the book shut. The cabin took on the smell of scorched leather and old glue. Tro in the ash pan kept a low glow that held. Nora saw a small thing on the floor by Jack's boot, a pebble green as a bottle left in a river. She picked it up and weighed it in her palm, smooth as a thought that does not scratch. Jack glanced down and then at her face. "It is from Blue Glass Gulch," he said. "I carry it for luck." She set it on the windowsill where the lamp could find its color. They cleaned what they could. The doctor came and packed the wound and left with a shake of his head that meant nothing except that he was waking at midnight for other people's trouble again. The sheriff tucked the book inside his coat and buttoned up against the rain. Lila tied a scarf over Nora's hair with firm hands and kissed the air beside her cheek in a way that said, "Stay upright." The storm eased sometime after midnight. The kettle had one last try at a whistle and quit. Jack sat in the chair by the door with the rifle across his knees and watched the room breathe. Nora slept on the cot with her hand near the mug as if warmth could be caught and held. Gray came at the edges of the window. The air smelled washed and raw. Jack stood his back aboard with knots and opened the door to the yard. The gate stood where he had left it. On the crosspiece, someone had pressed a hot iron and held it long enough to burn a mark into the grain. The letter was a V, clean and deep. Smoke wisped from the cut. The faint sour of scorched hair rode the damp like a memory that would not be pushed back. Dawn came thin and cold, the kind that makes a horse's breath look like smoke. Jack swung into the saddle with his shoulder bound tight. Sheriff Harlan Pike took the lead down the rocky cut behind the mesa. The earth smelled of wet iron. A thread of mist lay over the washes. They found the first sign where the track narrowed between two junipers. A smear of dark on a stone. A strip of coat snagged on a thorn. "He is bleeding," Harlan said. "He is thinking," Jack said. "Thinking hard is slower than running." They followed the river's bend into Blue Glass Gulch. The water here moved quick and clear over stones worn slick and green as bottles. Cottonwoods leaned in close. Jack's grazed arm burned each time the reins pulled. He did not change hands. He let the hurt set the rhythm of his breath. "There," Harlan said. Silas Vane sat half slumped against a boulder, one boot, braced, one hand pressed to his side. His coat was ruined. His face had lost the shine it wore in town. He smiled anyway, a thin curl that showed more teeth than warmth. "Look what the rain brought back," he said. "Mr. Rourke and his conscience." "Set your hands where I can see them," Harlan said. Silas spread his fingers on the stone. Palm blood made a dark handprint that tried to dry and could not. "You think this ends with my bad afternoon?" "We will take the ledger," Harlan said. "Then we will take you." Silas coughed. It hurt him and he hid it poorly. "You boys like simple stories. A bad man, a clean arrest, a town that sleeps." He lifted his eyes to Jack. "You do not even know who wrote the letters that sent your lady across the plains." "What letters?" Harlan said. Silas's grin found a last bit of life. "Ask your own people, Sheriff. The rot grows in familiar soil." His hand dropped toward the gun at his hip. Harlan saw it. Jack saw it first. The report cracked sharp between the stone walls and went up like a thrown plate. Silas slumped. For a breath he looked surprised. Then he looked like nothing at all. Harlan stood still until the dust he had kicked settled. He holstered his weapon and moved in. The revolver by Silas's boot lay empty. Harlan checked the satchel slung under the dead man's arm and cut the strap free with his pocket knife. Inside was a small roll of coin, a brass key, and a yellowed envelope tied with twine. The envelope had a name on it in a hand Jack knew in his bones before he read it with his eyes. Matthew Rourke. Harlan tucked the envelope away. Jack stared at the river until the blur of water steadied. He breathed through his nose. He brought his gaze back to the body and then away from it. He picked up a flat stone, turned it once in his good hand, and set it down where it had been. Nothing else needed moving. We ride, Harlan said. They took the long way out of the gulch. The horses found their footing on the wet slope. The ridge gave up to the plain, and the wire along the road sang in a key that promised neither comfort nor trouble, only distance. At the Rourke place, Lila Hart had opened every shutter. She set a lantern on the porch rail, one in the front window, and one by the stove, so the light built layers. Nora moved quiet and sure. She cleared the table and set the rifle where the plates had been. Her hands shook once. She put both palms on the wood, breathed, and the shake passed through her into the boards and was gone. They will not knock, Lila said. I know, Nora said. Dust rose on the road like breath. 4 men came fast across the flats. Their coats flapped. Their horses blew. One fired high and whooped. The sound rolled up the mesa and came back thinner. The men spread without speaking, one toward the corral, one toward the side yard, 2 for the porch. We just want what is ours, the nearest one called. Give us the book and nobody bleeds. Nora lifted the rifle and sighted along the barrel the way Jack had shown her, forearm, tight cheek, pressed, one eye soft. The lantern flame threw a gold line on the sight. Her heart hit her ribs twice, then fell into a pace she could ride. Drop your guns and leave, she said. The words tasted clean. The man laughed and raised his arm to fire. Nora's first shot took his hat brim and his nerve in the same second. He flinched right. The second shot hit the saddle tree and pitched him sideways to the dirt. He cursed and crawled toward his horse with a limp that would remember the day. Lila's pistol spoke from the side window, and a splinter leaped from the porch rail at the boot of a man who had thought the side yard was safer. We can talk, the last one called, voice higher than he wanted it. You were not talking when you slammed a door, Lila said. Her words were as flat as the plain. Nora chambered again. Sulfur burned her nose. The recoil pushed a bruise into her shoulder that would bloom later. She could hear her own breath and the little lick of the lantern on the step. The men saw the angle of it and understood what light can mean. It is a book for women's names, Nora said not loud. If you are not ashamed of it, come take it with your hands. None of them moved. The one on the ground pulled himself onto his horse with a sound like a nail drawn out of a board. The others followed him back into the dust, with their faces turned away so they would not have to see the cabin or the woman on the porch or the light she had set there on purpose. When the quiet came, it came quick. Sound fell through it small and clear, a bird in the cottonwoods, a drip from the edge of the roof. Nora lowered the rifle and held it at her side. Lila breathed out and made a small sign with her fingers she would have called a habit if asked. You stood square, Lila said. I stood, Nora said. She watched the road until the dust lay down again. Afternoon tilted toward evening. A wash of thin clouds softened the light. The smell of wet ash drifted from the firebox each time the stove breathed. Nora wiped the boards where rain and boots had mixed mud into a paste. She could feel the house settle by degrees, a slow unwinding from the storm and the shouting and the shots. Hoofbeats came up the road that was theirs. Not fast, not slow. The wire above them was quiet for once. Nora stepped off the porch and went down into the yard. She did not run. Jack and Harlan rode under the cottonwood's shadow, then into the open. Jack sat upright but gray around the mouth. His sleeve was wrapped and stained. Harlan looked like a man who had spent a day measuring distances with his spine. You are late, Lila said, which was her way of saying you came back. We found him, Harlan said. His voice carried the truth and left the rest in his pocket. He swung down and tied his horse to the rail that still bore its burned letter. He glanced at the mark, then at Jack's arm. You will need the doctor again if you do not sit. I am sitting, Jack said. Nora crossed the yard and stopped in front of him. You are standing, she said. His mouth twitched into a shape that might have been a smile if he had not been so tired. She reached for his unhurt arm, and he let her take it. The air between them had more in it than air. Sheriff Lila said, come inside. You look like you have paper that does not want to live in your coat. Harlan stepped into the cabin and set his hat on the peg by the door. He took the yellowed envelope from his inside pocket and laid it on the table. The lamp caught the raised grain of the paper, the places a hand had pressed too hard long ago. Mud from Blue Glass Gulch had dried along one edge in a pale crust. Jack came in with Nora beside him. He paused by the mantel without meaning to. The small oval photograph of Matthew sat square and dusted. He could see the boy he had been and the man his brother had tried to be. He could hear boots on a long-gone floor and a voice that had said his name without asking for anything in return. Harlan touched the envelope with 2 fingers. "This was in Silas Vane's satchel," he said, "addressed to you." Jack looked at his name, written in a hand he knew before he knew letters. The room went still around the paper. Outside, the wind moved through the sage and pushed a soft note from the wire that faded almost at once. On the face of the envelope, in dark ink, the sender's name sat plain above the town mark. Matthew Rourke. No one spoke for a while. The envelope sat between them and drank the lamplight. Jack cut the twine with his pocket knife and eased the flap. The paper inside had browned at the edges and gone soft where hands had handled it too much. He knew the slope of the letters before he blinked the blur away. "Jack," it began. "You will not go looking on your own, so I did the papers for you. A woman in a house gives a man a reason to quit fighting things he cannot beat. If she ever comes, treat her right. Do not scare her off with that stubborn streak. I put your name where it might do some good. That is all I got left. Your brother Matthew." Jack read it once without breathing. He read it again and let his breath settle. The room seemed to lean toward the page and then away. He folded the letter carefully and set it flat with the creases lined. He looked up and found Nora watching him with her hands quiet on the table and her mouth soft, as if a word had been set there and left to warm. Harlan cleared his throat. There was a lockbox sold off when the last postmaster died, and the office changed hands. Silas found old filings and made himself a trade. He did not forge this. He held up the envelope by its corner. He only used what he found the way a man uses a cheat in a deck. "I am sorry for the route it took to get here." Jack nodded once. He did not look at Harlan. He looked at the photo on the mantel and then at the empty chair by the stove. He put 2 fingers on the letter and felt nothing but paper. The hurt in his chest did not feel like a knife. It felt like a door pushed open in a house that had been shut too long. Nora turned the envelope so the name faced her. "Your brother thought you could be saved from the worst of yourself," she said. Her voice had no shine on it. It held. He might have been right. Jack did not answer. He stood up and put the letter on the mantel beside the photograph. The 2 sat together the way they should have sat years ago. A wind line ran along the ridge and drew a soft sound from the wire. The kettle gave a small whistle and did not build. Nora took it from the flame and poured water over grounds until the cabin smelled like something strong enough to carry weight. Harlan left with the book under his coat and a promise to meet in town before sunset. Word ran as quick as it always did. By the time the light went low, the square at Sagebrush Crossing was strung with lanterns, and the windows of the chapel were open to let sound out. The bell clanged once and then again in a careful rhythm. The faces gathered were the same faces that had been turning away for weeks. Now they stood with their hats in their hands. Lila Hart took the small makeshift stage, no dress finer than a clean apron. She did not raise her voice. "We are here because paper was used to do harm. We are here to put names back where they belong." She stepped aside and Harlan opened the black book on a crate by the church step. The pages had dried stiff. The ink had bled to shadows in places, but the names held fast where they mattered. Harlan read. Towns and routes. Women who had been sent places and women who had not made it. Men who had paid and men who had taken. He did not look up after each name. He let the sound of them carry as far as the cottonwoods. Coins clinked on the wood when someone had something to return. A folded deed, a ring that had never been worn, small papers that had been kept too long in drawers, apologies that had the shape of work rather than talk. Nora stood near the back where the shade reached the edge of the crowd. Lila stood at her side with her hand resting on Nora's elbow like a quiet pledge. Jack stood apart with his hat in his hand and his jaw tight. The book on the crate looked like a bit of river rock left on a bank after flood, ugly and stubborn and not gone. Someone called for Jack to speak. It passed through the people like a nudge. He stepped up because there was nowhere else to stand that would be true. He looked at the faces and then at Nora. He spoke without reaching for anything fancy. "I never sent for a bride," he said. Not once. He let the words hang where they were. He looked again at Nora, and the line at his mouth changed. "If I had, I would have asked for her." Noise rolled across the square, not loud. Hands came together. People exhaled. The bell did not ring. It did not need to. Harlan shut the book and held it under one arm. Lila wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand as if dust had found it. They rode home under a sky washed clean. The wire over the road was quiet. The mesa took the last light and turned it to honey. At the yard gate, the burned V still showed dark in the grain. Jack touched it once, and then let his hand fall. Inside the cabin had warm pockets of light where lamps had been set. The stove breathed a small glow. Jack built a swing for the porch out of pine and old tack. The rope he chose did not creak. It held, and it did not speak. Nora dug a narrow bed along the black scar where grass had not come back after the fire. She worked the ash into the soil until it went soft. She set wildflower seed by pinches and watered the line with a tin cup. The dirt took it. Later, when the sound of knives and cups and small chores had gone away, they sat on the swing without talking. The night smelled of sage and damp wood. The stars came out lazy. Nora reached into the window where she had left the river stone and held it in her palm. She turned it so the lamp could find the green. It felt like a thing that had been rubbed smooth by years of running water. "You carry this for luck," she said. Jack watched the stone, and then her hand. Luck is a word we use for everything we cannot name. He closed her fingers over it and left his hand there until the warmth moved between their skins. "People change slower than river rock," he said. "People change," she said. He stood and opened the door. The lantern behind the glass made a simple square on the floorboards, same as it had the night she first walked through. He looked at her in the doorway. The kettle began a small whistle that never learned to cry hard. "Welcome home, Nora," he said. "I already am," she said. The wind ran through the sage and turned the wire into a low silver string. On the far side of town, a train spoke once and kept moving. The house breathed and held. The swing eased to stillness. The letter on the mantel sat with the photograph as if they had been waiting for the same room and had found it. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story.